Hello, everybody. Bonjour. My apologies that I couldn't be there in person today. It seems like such a wonderful group of all of you talking about these ideas. It's one of my favorite parts of conferences, but I greatly appreciate the opportunity to tell you about the work that we've been doing on conspiracy beliefs. And thank you so much, Janie and Henry, for inviting me. So, my presentation today is on the work we've been doing on conspiracy beliefs, how we've evolved our thinking about the study of conspiracy beliefs, and the interesting relationships we're finding with actively open-minded thinking, which was a pleasure to hear it being mentioned several times today already. And so, in terms of the purposes of my talk, those are my goals. And what I'm going to be doing is talking about three different studies that we've been doing over the last couple of years. The first one explaining how and why we've changed our thinking on the study of conspiracy beliefs, further examination of the types of psychological variables that may predict conspiracy beliefs, and also starting to really think about how actively open-minded thinking may be important and possibly unique in explaining conspiracy beliefs. And so the first study, I'm just going to talk about parts of the findings. There's more information in these studies. I really want to make sure that I cover the full story. So please refer to this study for further information. But we've been interested in the study of conspiracy beliefs for a long time. So originally, we have a conspiracy belief subtest in our CART measure, our comprehensive assessment of rational thinking that we worked on together with Keith Stanovich and Richard West. And we continue doing work with Keith Stanovich in this area because conspiracy beliefs were obviously something very relevant to consider from the perspective of rational thinking. And with everything that's been going on over the last, I'll say at least decade, there's been a definite interest and increased interest in the study of conspiratorial thinking. And even at the time, when we considered putting in the conspiracy belief subtest in the CART, at that time, there really hadn't been very much attention to the idea of conspiracy beliefs in the context of rational thinking. And in this battery, the CART, so just as a little bit of a reference point for people who aren't familiar, we developed the CART, which is a battery of 19 subtests and 4 supplemental thinking dispositions. Across these subtests, we assess instrumental rationality, epistemic rationality with several different measures. And these subtests we think underlie rational thinking and also tap into certain types of knowledge, including probabilistic numeracy and financial literacy, what we might call the mindware of rational thinking. And in this measure, in our CART, we had a measure of conspiracy beliefs. In particular, we were looking at the endorsement of specific conspiracy beliefs that are known to be false. And at the time when we conceptualized conspiracy beliefs in the CART, and from the standpoint of an assessment of rationality, we considered conspiracy beliefs as a form of contaminated mindware or mindware that was going to be dysfunctional. And so, in the work that I want to describe here, which is going beyond what we had done in the CART when we published the prototype of the CART in 2016, we further examined conspiratorial thinking as a criterion variable, and we wanted to look at which components of rational thinking would predict variation in conspiracy beliefs. And so, just to give a little bit of background, so without giving away the full story, when you do a survey of the literature, there's actually 2 main methods that have been used to study conspiracy beliefs. And one of these measures is to examine conspiracy belief in terms of generic terms without mentioning a specific conspiracy. So in the top part of this slide, these are examples of more generic conspiracy belief scales. One of my students, Jala, and I also examined these types of scales in some research that we've published. And the other main method is to measure belief in a sample of conspiracies known to be false and to aggregate the responses across numerous such conspiracies. So looking at specific conspiracies and of the types as published in the study at the bottom of this slide. And so these two different concepts that are operationalized by these different methods seem to follow from two different ways that conspiracy belief has been defined in the literature. So the first type of definition is consistent with these generic measures of conspiracy belief. It's more neutral. It does not load the definition of conspiracy belief with extraneous components that tie the concept to irrational thinking. So at the top of this slide, more generic statements like a set of beliefs that are used to explain how a group of individuals is covertly seeking to influence or cause certain events. And alternatively, the second type of definition, illustrated at the bottom of this slide, adds to the basic notion of undetected actors, adding features that are more strongly associated with conspiracy beliefs that are unjustified, namely that the actors may be powerful, that the beliefs are epistemically risky, and that the conspiracy belief contradicts received views of events, and that the concealment may be conscious. And so the conspiracy belief subtest in the CART actually reflects the second definition because it focuses on the specific conspiracy beliefs that are actually known to be false. And the fact that we designed the conspiracy belief subtest at the time in this way reflects how we kind of thought about conspiracy beliefs, even in psychology in the era of the 2000s and up to about 2014, very much a dominant view of I know it when I see it attitude when it came to defining this phenomenon. And during this period, it was very conventional in psychology for researchers to assemble their scales by presenting participants with examples of some of the most outlandish conspiracy beliefs they could think of. So the Apollo moon landings were faked, for example, because it was just assumed from the outset that conspiratorial thinking necessarily reflected rational thinking. And so the CART model that we used to generate the conspiracy belief subtest followed this model. And so here are some additional examples of some of these items from this scale that reflect this I know it when I see it attitude using specific conspiracy beliefs. So in addition to false conspiracies, the construction of the conspiracy belief subtest does signal some awareness of general dispositional views of conspiracy belief because our subtest did contain some filler items, namely conspiracies that actually occurred, or we would call true conspiracies. And so this aspect of the subtest does reflect some awareness of these two definitions of conspiracy beliefs. And in the construction of our subtest, even though we had these filler items, we didn't really follow through with this insight because we didn't actually score them in the CART when we published this prototype in 2016. And so now what I would like to present to you is in our original work, we examined the correlates and predictors of belief in false conspiracies. And in this particular study, we wanted to look at predictors of both true and false conspiracies. And in addition to predicting true and false conspiracies, we also wanted to look at correlates of the ability to discriminate between these two types of conspiracy beliefs, namely discriminating between true and false conspiracies. And so in this study, we looked at the predictors of conspiracy beliefs with other measures from the CART, so all of the different subtests, the different thinking dispositions, and other predictors as well, including cognitive ability, political ideology, and religiosity. And in this table, we just have a display of these correlations. So correlations with false conspiracy beliefs. So the extent to which performance on these different measures and subtests was correlated with the endorsement of false conspiracies. And what we found is that the strongest predictor of conspiracy beliefs, so false conspiracy beliefs, were superstitious thinking, and actively open-minded thinking. Other variables that did correlate were cognitive ability and also probabilistic thinking and scientific thinking as well. And so this is very much in line with what we originally published. And so this is kind of a reflection of those findings. When we looked at stepwise regression of predictors of false beliefs or false conspiracy beliefs, we found that superstitious thinking entered first into the regression, followed by probabilistic thinking and the AOT scale. So again, very consistent with our original work. And then the new piece that we've added since the original cart is we wanted to look at the best predictors of true conspiracy items, which in the original cart we thought of as filler items, and now we're thinking of them as a criterion variable of interest. And overall, whoops, I didn't advance my slide. Oh, no, whoops. Where did I advance? Oh, there we go. Sorry. Keep track there. When we were looking at the correlations with true conspiracy beliefs, overall, we found much weaker correlations with components of the cart. And what we did find seemed to be significantly related to true conspiracy beliefs were the financial literacy subtest, and no other components displayed much of a correlation. And outside of the cart, the cognitive ability composite displayed a correlation of 0.265 with true conspiracy score as well. So what's also important to remember is the strongest correlate of the true conspiracy total score was actually the false conspiracy total score. That is, people who are prone to believe in true conspiracies were also more likely to be prone to believe in false conspiracies. And so this is an important correlation that led us to consider the discrimination index. So the discrimination index is it's a signal detection analysis where we examine the difference between correctly identified false conspiracies and subtracting the incorrectly identified true conspiracies. And we examined what would predict performance on the discrimination index. And so we found that this index was correlated with other variables, and the strongest correlate was the cognitive ability index and the other 5 variables that are listed here. So negatively related to superstitious thinking, positively related to actively open-minded thinking. And then we saw the financial literacy, scientific and probabilistic thinking also emerge as significant predictors. And so there we go. So when we examined the predictors in a final stepwise regression, we found that all of these had a significant beta weight and were significant variables predicting discrimination performance. And so this was a really important first study for us because it was extending our examination of false conspiracies and also examining what happens when we try to predict endorsement of true conspiracies as well as this discrimination index. And we found that many of the variables that we had previously examined consistently predicted belief in false conspiracies. And this is a summary table of these findings. So the false conspiracies in the first column explaining 29% of the variance. And then when we look at the third column of this table, the ability to discriminate true from false conspiracies included cognitive ability, scientific thinking, explaining 33% of the variance. So we see that some of the variables go obviously in different directions, and that's obviously very important. In the second column of this summary table, where we have the predictors of true conspiracy beliefs, we see that cognitive ability, actively open-minded thinking, and financial literacy contributed to predicting unique variance, 38% of the variance. And overall, these patterns would be in the expected direction when we see the direction of the variables. So what was nice to see is the superstitious thinking is positively related to endorsement of the false conspiracy beliefs, negatively related to the discrimination measure, as we would expect, and the actively open-minded thinking scale also basically behaving in the same direction. And so this first study, since publishing the cart, has really been important for shaping our thinking with how we're moving forward with the study of conspiracy beliefs. And it's gotten us to rethink how we look at conspiracy beliefs in the cart. And when we first added this subtest to the cart, we thought of it as a measure of contaminated mindware as part of the measurement of rationality. But at that time, we'd only examined false conspiracy items and treated the true conspiracy items as filler items. And so we really didn't analyze them at the time beyond just looking at them very briefly. And in this particular study, when we looked at the true items, we saw that the dominant predictor and a really important predictor was the extent to which people were prone to identify false conspiracies. So a huge correlation between the belief in false and true conspiracies. And so this suggested to us that there may be a dispositional component underlying both of these types of beliefs. And so the specific false belief scales that we used in the cart may not be capturing the full range of conspiracy mentality, including instances where this type of mentality may be efficacious. So these scales that are often conventionally used in the literature, they may choose a highly unrepresentative set of conspiracies and tend to pathologize conspiracy beliefs if used as a proxy measure of general conspiratorial mentality. So if such scales are going to be a measure of rationality, and we want to think about it in this context, then measures like the discrimination index should be considered as a metric where we're looking at people's ability to be able to discern or detect the difference between true and false conspiracies. Or we may also look at conspiratorial thinking more of as a thinking disposition, the way we look at actively open-minded thinking or deliberative thinking, as we've done in our dispositional measures. So that was sort of our first pass at thinking about conspiratorial beliefs as more of a dispositional type of metric. And so this took us to kind of a second study. And again, I'm kind of going to just cover some aspects of it. And I'd like to focus on the conspiracy beliefs aspect and the major additions in this second data collection. So this was the first time we collected data on conspiracy beliefs since the cart using these variables. And in this particular study, we elaborated our examination, not only examining false conspiracy beliefs more thoroughly, but also having a more thorough set of true conspiracy beliefs. We also examined additional psychological variables and predictors of conspiracy beliefs that have been examined in the literature. And we also included our revised actively open-minded thinking scale that revised from using not using the term belief that was creating some issue with that scale that we published in 2019. So using this updated AOT scale was also an important thing that we wanted to do in this study. And so from the vantage point of thinking about, the domain of conspiratorial thinking, and the fact that we had also kind of fallen into this tendency to use conspiratorial thinking items, what we call as an I know it when I see it attitude to define this phenomenon, namely this attitude that conspiratorial thinking is necessarily going to have, outlandish conspiracy beliefs that are likely false. We kind of followed suit and had a similar set of items in our conspiracy belief subtest. So, we wanted to kind of expand our perspective by having true conspiracy beliefs as well. But when you do have a look at the psychological literature to look at, what are the kind of psychological predictors and variables related to this, and some mentioned by Gord in his presentation as well. So the kinds of variables that people have looked at are things like narcissism, dogmatism, neuroticism, paranoia, schizotypy, and these types of variables. So we wanted to examine these as predictors as well in as we wanted to look at this construct more broadly. And by using the most blatantly false conspiracy beliefs as stimuli, these findings in general may have contributed to kind of a bit of a biased view on a conspiratorial mindset. So we wanted to broaden that in our study. And so the specific conspiracy scales that have been studied may not have captured kind of the full range of conspiracy mentality because they were missing instances where this type of mentality may be efficacious, namely conspiracies that actually turn out to be true. So what we did is based on this perspective, we elaborated our study to have both true and false conspiracy beliefs. And so based on both philosophical critiques and also there's been considerable work in the field of political science where there's actually a substantial literature on the potential adaptiveness of conspiratorial thinking in some instances. And so for these reasons, this elaboration and expansion of thinking about conspiratorial thinking was kind of warranted based on all these different reasons. And so from these different perspectives, we wanted to have a broader definition of conspiracy beliefs. And this is kind of our general way of thinking about it. Conspiracy beliefs referring to a belief that at least two agents have coordinated or colluded undetected by the public toward a goal of significant public interest. And so we're trying to neutralize and have a more minimalist definition of conspiracy beliefs. And we're hoping that broadening the definition doesn't, doesn't restrict conspiracy beliefs in the way that we've seen happen in the history of our psychological literature. It doesn't require direct contact among conspirators. It allows for kind of more tacit collusion or collaboration among a large number of actors. So those factors kind of neutralize how we think about conspiracy beliefs. And it also doesn't require that there's any malevolent intent behind the conspiracy, doesn't require any intentional secrecy. And so from this perspective, our definition doesn't stipulate that a conspiracy belief must necessarily be irrational or false. And so by integrating kind of these ideas and also some of the philosophical and perspectives in the political science literature, we kind of went ahead to elaborate our measure. And this framing is kind of helping us think about the scope and span of conspiracy beliefs. And so in this study, we had both false and true conspiracies, and we had 12 items of each. So we had more true conspiracies and a good number of false conspiracies. We also looked at the discrimination index. We also had some what we call partisan conspiracy beliefs, or another term we're using is contested beliefs. And these refer to more current topics where there may be some uncertainty in the sort of the truth of, the particular belief. So we were more focused on what we'd call mature conspiracies, to use the term by Keeley, that beliefs where we have some more established knowledge that they're likely to be false or true. And so these were our criterion variables. And then we elaborated some other psychological variables, both from the political science literature and also from the psychological literature. And you may remember earlier in my talk, I was talking about these measures that were more generic general conspiracy mentality types of measures. Um, these were more dispositional in nature and do not have content about specific conspiracies that require specific knowledge about actual events and uh, things like that. And so we actually sort of created a variable called the hidden causal forces scale, which captures a more generic conspiratorial ideation, which refers to this kind of definition in the conspiracy literature. And it builds on the ideas of hidden, undetected, unseen, opaque, or unrecognized causal forces that may be opaque to the public. And so the term hidden forces does mean that it's hidden from the public, but it doesn't necessarily imply that it's deliberately concealed. It's more just consistent with a more generic type of definition of a conspiratorial mentality. And in addition, these variables, so anti-establishment attitudes, government credulity, and utopianism, these have been more well studied in the political science literature. And so these have been related to conspiratorial thinking as well. So, in particular, anti-establishment attitudes. These may prime belief in hidden causal forces and conspiratorial thinking. So, they may foster beliefs in both true and false conspiracies. But also, there are political attitudes that may suppress belief in conspiracies, in particular, utopianism and credulity or trust in government. So we included these scales as further predictors that we wanted to examine in conspiracy beliefs. And some of the psychological variables we examined. So we examined the dark triad. So that's been well studied in the psychological literature. So paranormal belief, superstitious thinking that many of you would be quite familiar with as well, and actively open-minded thinking. And we also did include political ideology and religiosity as variables as well. So in this table, just presenting the correlations between these different variables, and the first column displays belief in false conspiracies. Second column has belief in true conspiracies, and the final column is the discrimination index. And what we see here is that when we're looking at predictors of false conspiracies, our strongest predictor is the hidden causal forces scale with a large correlation of about 0.71. The correlations in the mid 0.4s were shown by the paranormal beliefs in the AOT. So paranormal beliefs is positively correlated, the AOT negatively correlated. So we've seen those patterns before. And in terms of some of the other variables here, so we see the anti-establishment attitudes are positively correlated. Ideology, we see a large negative correlation there. So I should mention here that the direction of the ideology variable is higher ideology is consistent with a more liberal ideological perspective. Negative correlation would be more conservative. So belief in false conspiracies is negatively correlated then with kind of liberal ideology, and then a positive relationship with religiosity. And when we examined predictors of false conspiracy beliefs, what we found is that the hidden causal forces scale was actually a significant predictor when it was entered first, followed by actively open-minded thinking, as well as the paranormal belief scale. And these variables predicted over 60% of the variance. We did actually examine some path analyses based on these models, thinking about how these variables may be related, not just, in a linear variable way, looking at multiple variables and how they may explain belief in conspiracies. And I'd recommend having a look at our paper, something I didn't think I could cover in our talk today. There, more elaborate models can be found there. When we look at relationship with belief in true conspiracies, We see that the dominant predictors are hidden belief in hidden causal forces, just like the belief in false conspiracies, as well as anti-establishment attitudes. So similar again to false conspiracies. Um, so we also see that actively open-minded thinking was not correlated substantially, very different than we saw with false conspiracies and relatively uncorrelated, relatively. And the paranormal scale also is relatively uncoordinated. So we see a bit of a different pattern here when we're looking at the relationships with true conspiracy beliefs. And when we examined the discrimination index, and what we found is that the discrimination index was negatively correlated with our hidden causal forces scale. So higher discrimination means basically uh, better discrimination of false from true conspiracies. And so that was actually negatively correlated with hidden causal forces, also positively correlated with actively open-minded thinking. So it's that pattern is expected that higher actively open-minded thinking is better discernment of false from true conspiracies. And that's a different pattern than we see from AOT with the false conspiracies and then the basically no real relationship with the true conspiracies. And then several other relationships in this table. So the significant negative correlation with paranormal beliefs and other variables that come up. So government credulity, there's a negative correlation. Ideology, there's a positive correlation. And then a significant relationship with religiosity. So some of those are perhaps expected and consistent with what others have found in the literature as well. For example, I'm thinking of your work there, Gord. So this second study, where we wanted to kind of elaborate and extend our understanding of other variables that may be related to conspiracy beliefs, I think one of the important things that we learned is that these generic conspiracy scales, we've been conceptualizing them as very different than these specific conspiracy scales, like what our CART subtest was based on. And it's perhaps not surprising that these generic conspiracy scales that we've named a belief in hidden causal forces scale is a significant independent predictor of both true and false conspiracies. So that's likely more of a dispositional type of variable. And so this, I think, is an important variable for us to kind of uh, think about in this way to kind of help us broaden our understanding of how we think about conspiracy beliefs beyond the I know it when I see it, where we just are focused on the false conspiracy beliefs that like the specific ones that we've looked at previously in the literature. So I think this is a useful way to extend our thinking and broaden perspectives on conspiracy beliefs. And then the trait of hidden causal forces, the fact that it has these different relationships with these other variables, such as actively open-minded thinking and paranormal beliefs, they seem to kind of cohere a little bit with some of these other variables, but the kind of the joint relationship of these variables, which we did examine in further path models, may help us kind of build some psychological models of, the predictors, the potentially the different predictors of true and false conspiracies. And in particular, the fact that the AOT is significantly related to discrimination kind of suggests to us just a kind of a broader model of how these variables sort of relate together, but also may separate in predicting and explaining true and false conspiracies. And then finally, I think the psychological variables, so they weren't the entire story. I think the idea of these political attitudes is another set of measures that may help us importantly understand who's going to be more susceptible, think about different reasons why people may hold specific conspiracy beliefs, variables like to what extent people have anti-establishment attitudes, about the role of, organizations and sort of systems that kind of may have rules for, how society works, for example, government credulity, so the extent to which people trust the government as, making decisions that, affect society and the public, and utopianism, to what extent people think that we could reach some idealistic values in our society and that things could, function in some idealistic manner. And I think all of these variables and people's propensity and variation in where, how people rate themselves on these kinds of variables may be important and relevant for explaining the extent to which they believe in, true, false conspiracies and being able to discriminate these conspiracies. And so I think this particular study kind of extending and expanding our thinking about conspiracy beliefs, including true conspiracies, that and the discrimination index broadens, I think, looking at this as the full extent of conspiracy beliefs that recognize that there may be true and false conspiracies. It gets us away from the kind of classic thinking in our field that all conspiracies are necessarily false. I think a measure of conspiratorial mentality, like the hidden causal forces scale, is yet another way to kind of broaden our perspectives so that this mentality isn't necessarily, leads to the thinking that, conspiracies are always necessarily false. I think these are very useful to appreciate the continuum of conspiracy beliefs so that we can have a kind of a richer perspective that takes into account, I think expanding these tools in this way is very important to kind of help us advance our research in this area. And I hope I have enough time to talk a little bit about this final study. Um, we wanted to look even more in depth at the role of actively open-minded thinking in predicting conspiracy beliefs. And I think this is where, for those of us really interested in the study of reasoning and rationality, this is where I get particularly excited too. It's fun hearing Valerie and Gord talk about the AOT as well. And, in particular, something that you mentioned in your talk, actually, Gord, is the relationship between AOT and ideology. And that was something we wanted to have a closer look at to see whether, AOT is doing anything, maybe a bit more unique than something like the ideology variable. That was something we wanted to examine in this study. And so many of you are probably very familiar with the AOT scale, so I won't talk too much about that. But the most recent version that we've been using is the 13 item scale that we published in 2023. And this scale is much shorter. And we've also revised the wording of these items so that we don't have the issue with the term beliefs that we know may differentially disadvantage some participants. There we go. That's that item that goes against their belief. So anyway, the belief revision item. So it was adapted to make sure that it didn't have those particular issues. And we had a whole bunch of variables in the study. So this is quite a large list, but many of them should be familiar to you from the study that I just talked about. And so yeah, the same domains of variables, including political attitudes, psychological attitudes. In addition, we also had several mature conspiracy beliefs, including both true and false conspiracies. And a couple of additions in this study is we had a bit more emphasis on ideology, political affiliation, and we also included measures of right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. Okay, so, oops, there we go. Okay, so again in this study, We had just want to point out that the ideology variable, so a higher score in ideology, indicated a more liberal mindset, liberal ideology. So we had a couple of different measures. We examined ideology, economic, social perspectives, and had a composite measure as well. We also examined political affiliation. So these were American participants. We asked if they would have voted for the Republican or Democratic Party. And then we have the variables of right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism as well. And so I heard you mention this in your talk, Gord, the correlation between actively open-minded thinking and ideology. We know that there is a relationship where higher actively open-minded thinking has been correlated with a higher, more liberal ideology. And so what we see in our own data set here is there is a positive correlation, there we go, between ideology and our score on the AOT scale, which indicates that liberals tended to score higher on the AOT than did conservatives. And we also see that in terms of political affiliation, so those who scored higher on the AOT scale were more likely to be Democrats than Republicans and independents. And so these are some really interesting and novel findings, I think, with the right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism scales together here. But we wanted to see whether ideology would be related to right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism. And what we found here is AOT in particular had a significant negative correlation with right-wing authoritarianism. So that actually has been published before in the literature. Whoops, I advanced a little bit too quickly here. Whoops, where did I go? Oh, sorry about that. There it goes. And when we go kind of across the table, or we see that the right-wing authoritarianism is also kind of negatively correlated with all these other ideology variables, which makes sense because a lower score on ideology was related to more conservative viewpoints. And then in the bottom of this table, when we look at left-wing authoritarianism, we see a positive correlation between ideology. So endorsing a more liberal ideology was significantly correlated with left-wing authoritarianism. But the last part of the scale that last part of this table that I'd like to point out is there's actually a significant negative correlation between AOT and left-wing authoritarianism. So it was nice to see that we see it seems that AOT is not correlated with either right-wing or left-wing authoritarianism, but we see kind of a differential pattern with ideology there. So anyway, thinking about AOT, how it may separate from liberal ideology. And so that was kind of one of our purposes in this study is we wanted to see how AOT might kind of separate from ideology and whether that might help us think about, how to measure conspiracy beliefs. And in this particular table, we've got a pattern of correlations with ideology, with our different psychological and variables and political science variables, as well as AOT. And it is AOT, and not liberal ideology that may be tracking adaptive behavioral and psychological states. So in particular, we see that the AOT is correlated with many kind of these variables. So we see a significant negative correlation with paranormal beliefs or superstitious thinking, significant negative correlation with the dark triad, so the narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, and also a significant negative correlation with paranoia. Ideology does not correlate with these variables with the same magnitude or in the significant direction as AOT does. And so we see some separation between ideology and AOT in this way. And in addition, when we looked at the anti-establishment attitude scale, so we see that there isn't much differentiation here with ideology and AOT, but when we have a look here at these other variables that came from the political science literature, we do see a significant correlation with the hidden causal forces scale, which is like the more generic measures of conspiracy belief scales, a significant negative correlation with both ideology and AOT. However, when we look at government credulity, we see a significant correlation between trust in government and ideology, particularly holding a more liberal ideology, but we see a negative correlation with that with the AOT. So the AOT seems to be tracking differently than just ideology, which is just a really interesting thing to kind of pull apart a bit, knowing that ideology and AOT have shown this relationship in the literature. And so going on to the conspiracy belief measures. So in this table, we have our various psychological measures, including the AOT and ideology. And the first column is the discrimination index of our true and false conspiracies. Then we have the false conspiracies in the second column, and then the true conspiracies in the final column. And what we see in the first column here is that AOT is significantly positively related to the discrimination index. So individuals higher in actively open-minded thinking displayed better discrimination of false from true conspiracies. Then we see a similar positive kind of effect with the ideology composite. So those who hold a more liberal ideology also had kind of a higher correlation here. And as we go across the table here, we see that AOT has a significant negative correlation with false conspiracies, which we've seen before, and then basically a kind of a non-zero relationship with true conspiracies, but it's actually not going in the negative direction, which I think is important. And there we go. And then the relationship with ideology also showed a similar pattern with false conspiracies, but a slight negative, but still close to zero relationship with true conspiracies. And so I think the other thing I'd like to point out while we're looking at this table here, again, we see these other variables that come from the political science literature, the anti-establishment attitude scale and the hidden causal forces scale. They both show positive relationships with both false and true conspiracies. So these scales are importantly related, but may not be related to that discernment or detection or of the differences between true and false conspiracies. And same with government credulity, we see significant negative relationships across both false and true conspiracies. There we go. And we looked at a couple of other kind of relationships I wanted to kind of point out. So in this study, I wanted to just bring our attention to thinking about actively open-minded thinking. Is this scale doing something special in the context of conspiracy beliefs and these other variables that have been related or examined in conjunction with conspiratorial thinking? A couple of other variables that have been examined more in the political science literature, so anti-democratic attitudes and political violence. With these variables, we see AOT kind of stands out here again. For both of these variables, there's a significant negative relationship between AOT. So higher AOT scores, lower anti-democratic attitudes, and lower endorsement of political violence. Ideology, just one up from the bottom from AOT, has a significant positive relationship with these variables. And as we go up and look at the numbers on this table, we see that, many of these scales are actually in the positive direction. And so AOT kind of stands out here as being unique. And so this third study, I wanted to kind of present at least part of it. I know this was a lot of information and perhaps a lot of data, but to summarize, I think this third part kind of shows us in these data patterns that AOT has a significant negative correlation with many different variables like the paranormal beliefs, the paranoia, the dark triad, but the ideology composite variable either doesn't correlate or may correlate in the wrong direction with these. So we may see AOT kind of nicely separate from this ideology variable, which may be very useful for us to operationalize and measure things like these conspiracy beliefs. And the ideology composite and most other variables, they displayed significant positive correlations with things like anti-democratic attitudes and tendency towards political violence, whereas AOT had a significant negative correlation. And so there may be something kind of interesting that we are hoping to pursue further with the AOT as we continue thinking about the role of the AOT in predicting, metrics relevant for rational thinking. And so, what is it? Is it about the AOT that may be really useful here? I think it's something importantly related to epistemic regulation. And I think I'm trying to remember the person who was talking about cognitive decoupling. So this idea of decontextualizing and these decoupling features that we've talked about in the context of reasoning and some of the dual process models where this has come up. The AOT may have some decoupling aspect that helps with perspective taking, allows us to distance ourselves from what we believe. It's a mental style, and AOT scales may be measuring our tendency to engage in this type of decoupling. Oh, I seem to have disappeared. You can still hear me?
Yes, but I fear
Oh.
this is all the time we have for you.
Oh, okay. Well, I was nearly at the end.
Question period.
Okay, sure.
Sorry about that,
Close
but
up
yeah.
The drink, it's fine.
So
close your camera though.
did I close my camera accidentally? I don't know. No, I didn't. How strange. Okay. Anyway, I don't know what happened, but I was getting close to wrapping up, and I think this is kind of where we're at with our work, thinking about what is the AOT doing, and continuing to try to see if we can think about the places where AOT correlates and doesn't correlate with other variables, and yeah, just a slide with some acknowledgments, and these are the sort of the publications and presentations where this work has been presented, and that's it. Great. Okay, thank you. Oh,
Thank you, Maggie. Maybe we can take a few minutes to for a few questions. Oh, great, perfect. Maybe we can take a few questions, then a short break, and then all these questions that you might have now or more can be asked during the panel. Yes, Valerie. Maybe I'm thinking to be sure that Maggie hears us. Maybe for the questions, if you guys come under this. This X is the microphone.
Hi, Maggie.
hi, Valerie.
Hi. Good to see you, even from afar.
Yeah.
So really, really interesting. And I'm just wondering, those relationships that you showed between AOT and some of the personality variables, the liberal ideologism, the liberal ideology, and so on. What in your mind is the basis of those relationships? I mean, some of them seemed really strange. The one with the liberal left leaning, I think we've seen before, but even so, what would be the basis of that, much less the relationships with the personality traits?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, Valerie. And I think this is why we're kind of expanding our repertoire of thinking. So I think, the psychological variables that we commonly know in this literature, like the narcissism, the schizotypy, these kinds of variables, they're maybe not quite as related, but I think these variables that people have been examining in the political science literature, like these are other kinds of tendencies that may importantly underlie things like liberal ideology. So in our studies, it's really quite incredible how powerful, rating, the political party you voted for, or you're just whether you're liberal or conservative, what are the variables underneath that? And I think that, things, I'm actually quite excited by things like the government credulity, anti-establishment attitudes, which has been related to kind of variables like populism, um, and also, what was the third one? Anti-establishment attitudes, government credulity. So these seem to be differently, they relate differently to ideology. And so I think we start to map out some perspectives on what kinds of dispositional tendencies, styles, maybe political ideology is, like government credulity was positively related with liberal ideology, but not in the direction of conservatives. And those tendencies, when we look at multiple variables together, I think we start building models of what may lead to, believing certain conspiracies. And, to a point that Gord made earlier, we kind of looked at a number of different conspiracy beliefs together. But a point I want to make is that there may be important differences in who believes in which particular conspiracies, and we could start to build these psychological models to understand, what kinds of, tendencies and mechanisms like these scales may help us understand who's more likely to believe in certain conspiracies than others. So, yeah, I think this is kind of our first pass at trying to elaborate these things, beyond the original ways that I think our literature started doing this.
Yes, can you come?
Yeah.
Thank you, Maggie. Gordon is coming to the mic. We're just gonna to be sure you can hear them.
Yeah.
It's under X.
Hi. Look at the camera. It's like I want to look at you. I gotta go over here though. But
Oh my goodness.
hi. So on that, I guess on the last thing, one thing I'd say is that some of that might have to do with like anti-intellectualism and like the connection, or like there's a connection, particularly in the States, between like projecting science and put on the right wing and all that kind of stuff. But in our studies with debunking, Republicans did not change their minds less than Democrats. I think some of it might have to do with like endorsement or valuing, and John Barron talks a lot about AOT as being a kind of value or like an epistemic kind of system, and less about like necessarily a kind of thinking style. But I don't know. That's actually not my question. But what I want to ask you is about like, and people have talked to me about this before too, is like whether we should distinguish between conspiracies and conspiracy theories. Because a conspiracy, in the way that you're defining it in a more expansive form, can be whatever fits your definition. In fact, you and I could have conspired to like ask questions to this panel or whatever. Whereas if you talk about conspiracy theories, there's like a set of things that we culturally associate with a conspiracy theory, which is like the moon landing and 9/11, all these things. And they're sort of different. Like there's like the kind of literal thing that can be a conspiracy. Then there's like kind of a cultural idea of what counts as a conspiracy theory that you would ask about. And so when in our studies, when we ask people to write about a conspiracy they believe in, they never talk about some mundane version of thing. They always talk about something that's in the kind of popular consciousness of a conspiracy theory. And so maybe that would be like one way to distinguish between these things so that we're clear about what we're talking about and when. Does that make sense to you, or am I off base on this?
Yeah, I think the fact that you're raising this, Gord, is like exactly the things we should be talking about, is kind of asking questions about these terms that we use and what they mean, right? I as you talk about the term conspiracy, we kind of stopped using the term conspiracy theory because in a way it was almost like a very loaded term, right? It's very much in the roots of that early psychological research where it's got this negative connotation of, those, more, extreme, clearly false conspiracies. And I think the term conspiracy belief I think it's part of this effort to neutralize the landscape in that way. And I guess yeah, I think we need to do more of that kind of groundwork, right? So that we're really clear on these operationalizations because, conspiracy theory, like, one of the things that I think a lot about, and I mean, you're in the States now, we're I guess in Canada, and we're watching, but we're right next to everything. And people are so quick to weaponize these terms, right? And something like the term conspiracy theory, because it's kind of got that loaded history, and as soon as we mention that, people assume that these are necessarily the study of all these strange wacky kind of beliefs. And I think, yeah, so conspiracy beliefs is trying in an effort to neutralize a little bit. And to take one step further, I mean, you were talking about examples of the what was it, the climate kinds of items. I mean, we're also kind of using the term contested beliefs because, there's sort of denial of, you know, people landing on the moon from the 1960s. But when we're dealing with beliefs that are more current, where the data are kind of emerging. We don't know what exactly is going on. We're kind of using the term contested beliefs to see whether there's something importantly different, right, about the predictors, the psychological mechanisms. And I think our study needs to make sure that we have kind of that adequate landscape so that we can fully map out the range of these patterns and such. And ever since we published the AOT scale with the issue with the belief items, I guess I can't emphasize enough how much humility I feel like we need to be ever so careful not to valence anything, right? I think it's our natural tendency. I think about Dan Gilbert that we kind of valence things immediately as necessarily kind of good or bad. And there's a sense to the conspiracy beliefs that we just have to make sure that we try to make it as operational as possible so that we can kind of see the range of relationships and see where things, may cohere and be importantly related, across ideology. But anyway, I'm not sure if I've answered your questions in there, but these are very much the kinds of things that we're thinking about how to define and make sure that we have the breadth of, you know, what we should be studying in there.
Thank you, Maggie. I think we had another question. Can you come close to the mic, or you can stay, like, if you stay here, you're away from the camera. When you close enough to be heard.
Does anyone hear me? Hello? UFOs? The Big Brother, this for Big Brother's listening to me now.
Okay. I think we can hear you. Thank you.
Does she? Does
Yeah, because
Can you hear him, Maggie?
A little bit. I'm wondering who's
Speak up a
speaking.
little bit.
Bonjour.
Okay, it's a question from the audience.
Okay, yeah.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
I can
Please
hear you
try
a
and
little
speak.
bit. Yes.
Well, my question revolves most around your criteria and their persistence in the development of humans. Your person, I'm assuming, are most likely young adults to adults and etc. But what about young people, especially with social medias in which a big difference that there had been between, let's say, our periods in the 90s or the 80s, that in the 90s or the 80s, you had to interpret, create a bit your conspiracy theories or find groups in the littles, and it wasn't what we could consider the whole global world. But in our ages, algorithm make that what you see on the internet seems to be the entire world. And when you enter into this hole of conspiracy theories, it seems like everything around you is revolving around such that this is the actual world, that this is actual truth. And this must have problems into reasoning and reflection around the age and popular age and on emotional and affective capabilities. What do you think about that?
Wow, there's a lot in there. I'll just have to maybe hone in on something that you asked about, I guess, earlier, and there's a lot in your kind of comments there. Young people and social media and I guess I'm kind of focusing today on the measurement issue of conspiracy beliefs. And if you're pointing our attention, which I think is a very good point, is this issue of knowledge. That's a tough one, right? Because these specific conspiracy beliefs, you need to have knowledge to know, whether they're true or false. And when you mention young people as well, and all the exposure that young people have to social media, if I were to kind of articulate one of the things that I think I worry the most about is young people being exposed to all of this information and the knowledge that they may lack, which makes sense that they don't have. And this is one of the reasons my former student Jala she and I really wanted to study conspiracy beliefs in young people. And we ended up publishing a study where we focused on these generic conspiracy belief scales. But there's a really important measurement issue there. And we're going to have to figure that out, right? If we're going to tackle these issues and think about how do we equip people, to help them figure out how to discern, better from worse, beliefs and knowledge that is available. That's going to be an important factor. But anyway, I'm going to actually return to you because there was more in your question, and I'm not sure if I really tapped into any of it.
Well, yeah, so it's just we have more to study and more to discover.
We're unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the questions. Thank you for your question. We're going to take a short break, 5-minute breaks, and then we're going to come back with the panel discussion. Wait, thank you.